绍一下，我的名字叫陈代月，我是这次博班实验室的策划人。然后呢，这次的主题叫做迈向未知之境呢，就是我们讲说，迈向未知是一个研究非常重要的事情，而未知我们通常会联想到的是认知的知，也就是我们知识是如何透过我们知识性的探索来知道一些我们不曾探索过的或是询问过的问题。但是呢，在这里我想要取它的双关或是另外一个含义，也就是感知的知。这个知呢，在英文里面可以是一个 perception， 关于一个感知的一个探索。所以有什么样的方式，我们可以去感觉到我们从前不曾感觉到的这些事物呢？而这是否也是一种研究，一种关于感知的研究？所以呢，这个系列呢，我们邀请到不同的领域的讲者，包含音乐学的讲者，包含戏剧研究的讲者，舞蹈研究、视觉艺术相关的、与文化资产相关的讲者，这是学习让我们共同来探讨关于这个感知迈向未知之境的这样的主题。同时有另外一个主题呢，是关于实践的这件事情。因为呢，我们知道在台湾的博士班的系统呢，开始出现实践研究，也就是不是透过论文书写，透过表演或者是实践的记录，也可以成为毕业的一种方式。那呢，我们在这里呢，要探讨关于实践研究的一些方法论或可能性，也就是关于我们通过实践如何呢，能够建构出知识，而这个知识可能也具有普同性跟传递性，然后可以成为一个有趣的一个讨论的空间。在此呢，我们邀请到这个来自英国巴斯思巴大学的教授 Thomas Kampe 来为我们进行今天的演讲。这个演讲的主题呢是Body Soma Self Embodiment and Creative Arts Research， 中文翻成身体、身心、自我体现与身心艺术的研究。这个 Soma 是一个蛮难翻的一个字，它讲求的是身心作为一个整合的概念，所以呢，我们就在中文有身心学的这样的一个名词，但是其实很难找到一个很好的翻译来就这个字，所以我们可能也可以直接用 Soma 这样的字来描述。然后接下来的演讲呢，基本上会是英文进行，所以我尽量不打断等一下的过程。但是如果有任何人对英文的聆听是比较感觉没有办法掌握的话呢，也许我会跟讲者讨论，再看看调整这样语言跟活动的关系是怎么样进行，是现在场域中的所有人最自在的一个形式。然后每样的形式呢，就会有一些是他的演讲的，另外一些可能会带一些活动，所以我就是创造了这样的空间，让这两件事可能可以进行，因为它会是一种随机的，取决于当下的一种回应。So I'm thinking about how the language is processing in the program. There might be some people who need help in translation, and so we'll see how it's happening. And if everyone needs help, just tell me, and I'll do my best in translation. And there's a kind of a part which is in the lecture form, so it's a bit be seated comfortably. But maybe there's a part that we might do some activities, so it's also leaving a space for this to happen. So anyway, I just officially introduce Professor Thomas and started this session.
So I don't know how I've arrived at this situation that I'm a professor for dance and somatic practices and all these kind of things. It was never the plan. It was never the plan. It just happened because I have a love and a passion for this. And because I am fortunate to live in a culture where artistic research and practice research is possible. Yeah? So in the UK, maybe form a circle. So originally I studied to become a visual art and English language teacher in Germany, in a place called Kassel, where there's the famous exhibition called Documenta, and I grew up with Josef Beuys and with Marina Abramovic, and with I had tea with Merritt Oppenheim, and I met Josef Beuys, and they were around in my childhood. I lived here, and the park where the exhibition was just there. That was my playground. And it was always embodied. I always climbed on the sculptures and interacted. It was a lived experience. And I was very much fascinated with performance art, body art, installation, this kind of revolutionary 1970s different culture in Germany. In a very repressed Germany. Very repressed. My father was a Nazi soldier. My father was with the Hitler army. It's like that's the kind of history where I come from. So very, very repressed. So this was a liberation for me, art. And then an even better liberation for me was to study dance. Wow. Dance. In England. In England, to go to England in 1982 and to study German expressionist dance. Strange. Laban figures, improvisation, space. Wow, space, make space visible. Wow. Space, shape, dynamics, body. I loved it. It just was so joyful, so wonderful. And humor. The English are funny. They are funny and generous. So I finished my teaching degree in Germany, and then I went to England to continue dance training. And I was able. They said, "We like an older student. It's very nice. We like a mature student. Would you like a cup of tea?" They're very friendly. Like Taiwanese people. They're very friendly and sweet. And would you like a cup of tea? And we like a boy who's 30, like a 30-year-old boy. And so it was always friendly. It was nice. I was able to study dance because I was interested and because I loved it, not because I was good at it. I was good at it, but not because of that. Because I was interested. And I was able to do a degree, a graduate degree, undergraduate degree in dance in England. Wow, because I loved it. And I was able to study postgraduate there, and I was able to teach in universities. And I built a whole career, and I also worked for 20 years as an artist. I worked with theatre companies, doing choreography and visual art work, doing installation work with theatre companies, and also performing and directing, and so working with visual art and dance and movement knowledge to work cross-disciplinary. And when I got my first job in the University of Chichester, they were really keen on having me. They really wanted me. I have nothing, I don't know. Why did they want me? Because I was performing internationally. I had many good reviews with good theatre companies and some good dance companies. And I didn't know that they could count this practice as research. That my practice would count for them as research. My professional practice could be research. If I articulated it as research. Yeah? And so I was working for 9 years in a university where we kind of learned how to look at your practice and say, well, this is research, this is just professional, but here you're really inquiring, and can you articulate, write about this? Can you say what your questions are? Can you say what your processes are? Yeah? So I began to understand that there's a whole practice as research, performance as research, art research culture in the UK. And that became normal for me. In my next job, I was part of a research center, and then I did my PhD, a practice-based PhD, practice-led PhD, which I will talk about. And now I'm a professor in the field, and I run a research group, and I connect people, and I run festivals in Boston. Often with the topic of embodiment and liveness and somatics. I will talk more about this. But none of this was planned. Everything just happened, and I I just keep working on this, and I keep learning, and I keep studying, and I keep listening and watching. I try to stay active as a teacher and also as a maker, as a mover, as a maker. So, and that's very exciting. And I'm 60, so that's nice to still have a hobby. So that's a little bit about me. I will talk more about me, but just to say it's really great to be here, really nice, and I'm super delighted to be part of a research culture. I think performing arts research is just really, really exciting because it allows us to work creatively, and it allows us to step outside of capitalist commodification in the arts and really explore difficult, critical, interesting things, processes, practices. And it's a field of freedom, and we must fill this. We must continue to fill this with freedom of thought and freedom of practice. And I'm very happy to be part of this in my life, and so to be amongst you as colleagues. I call this Body, Soma, Self, Embodiment and Creative Arts Research. Body, Soma, Self was a title of a series of research labs I did over 5-6 years as part of my PhD. And it's also a title of a paper I've just written, which is published as a paper for PhD students. It's a guidance to maybe some ideas of how to use somatic practices in inquiry. And so I thought that's a nice title. I should reuse that again. So I reuse that again. For no other reason. So let me see where we're going here. I will try to talk a little bit about embodiment in arts research and embodiment in general. I'm still puzzled about what embodiment or embodiments might mean. I will give some perspectives on that. There are many perspectives on embodiments and embodiment. I will just open the door a little bit for that, if that's okay. Yeah? And I will give some examples of research contexts. Organizations like the research group that I'm co-running, Creative Corporealities Research Group, the International Feldenkrais Federation Research Journal, for example, where practitioners have written about work in creative practice, which I've just edited, or the Journal for Dance and Somatic Practices, really important journal in the UK. It's been a real fantastic effort to support the field. That journal changed everything for me. Wow, when I read some of these things there, I thought, oh my God, now I know where I'm located. This is very exciting, for example. There is a project at the moment called the Somatic Toolkit. Please Google that. That's a toolkit for researchers in non-dance and all sorts of environments. And Somatic Toolkit. How do we engage as researchers with embodiment through somatic practice? And there might be scientific, hard scientist researchers or social sciences researchers or others. And the embodied researchers working group, which I've just joined, as another example. I'll just introduce you to these things. I will talk distinctly about somatic practices as a field of study in the Western and also Asian field, less in Africa in that way, but in quite global field of inter and transdisciplinary practices. And I will talk about two research projects. My PhD project called The Art of Making Choices, which was a practice-led PhD. I also published papers at the same time because I found that really important to write about the work and to put myself out there and to test my knowledge and to learn how to articulate my concerns through writing and talking. And I will talk about a dance history project, because I'm a hobby historian, called Releasing the Archive, which I've been working over the last 5 years with a colleague called Carol Brown in Australia. She's now in Australia, she was in New Zealand, and a series of, or not a series, a group of professional partners, museums, dance companies, individuals, art centers, and so on. And I will, if we get there, also introduce you to examples of embodiment in research of 2 PhD candidates who I'm co-supervising. Gosh. And there'll be loads of other things. That's so great. So, here's a wonderful quote by a Professor Gesa Ziemer from Germany. She's an arts researcher. She talks about research in the arts, which most of us, where we based on. She talks about art research is an area where there's nothing to know, or at least not linguistically, where linguistic eloquence is being slowed down, where we are disoriented and touched at the same time to perceive something. Just look at that language that she's used here. This is very much a somatic language, an embodied language. We're slowing things down, we're disoriented, and we're touched at the same time to perceive something. She already opens out a kind of research world here for us, or even aspects of a methodology. This is exactly where new questions and ways of seeing emerge. Not even new questions of making, she's talking about, but new questions and new ways of seeing. She begins with that. Perhaps that's relevant. It is never art for art's sake, indirectly influences attitudes, values, ways of interacting and action. Art forms the social through and through without being social work. So she also advocates that the relevance here of art and art research as being relevant, culturally relevant in the social world. Shut up. And so she kind of proposes a transdisciplinary perspective here. Transdisciplinarity meaning that we're working interdisciplinary, but also beyond the field into the world. That our disciplinarity has meaning in the world beyond the discipline. Applied in the social field, applied to real life contexts. So, embodiment. Gosh, I was thinking about, why this word is so fashionable and fancy. I've recently used the word myself. Every year I run a conference or symposium, and this year, because I'm a professor of somatic practices, I thought I want to run a symposium on embodied learning. I don't want to use the word somatics, because then only the dancers and the theatre people will come. But not even the theatre people, only the dancers will come. If they will come. Yeah? So, but if I use embodiment, maybe that's a broader understanding of that what we're talking about. Maybe the educators will come too, and the social scientists will. They didn't come. It was only the dancers who came. But I hope they will come. So what I thought the most important thing, of course, is the step away from body as object. But a step towards understanding that we as creatures are embodied and embodying, and the other co-creatures in the world are also embodying. We are processes, we are in process. I have not much hair left. I have gone through male menopause with 10 years of feeling dizzy and getting fat and strange, and I feel quite good now. I'm changing, we're changing all the time. We are in process. I'm not the same as I was this morning. I was very tired this morning, now I'm quite up and excited. Yeah? So we're processual. And there is, of course, a constructivist perspective on this. basically saying, and that's what Feldenkrais also says, we are under construction and we are being constructed by the world. Patriarchal society constructs us, capitalism constructs us, racist, white supremacist cultures construct us. They all construct us, or aspects of us. But we're not only passive witnesses and malleable, we are constantly under construction. If I have these bad chairs to sit on all day, I have a body that's very closed in, and maybe I'm all the time not feeling very well, and I'm not thinking very well. Yeah. We also have there is also a link what Carrie Nolan wrote about between agency and embodiment. We have choice in how we are in our process. We can steer our process. We can change the quality of our process. We have a little window that we can open and let the light in. So within that process, we are not only the passengers in the car, we are also the drivers, to some extent, as much as we can. And that's very interesting, particularly in the somatic world, we're looking at that. What's the potential for agency? How do I articulate that? In my daily work with the students, how do I make them feel that they have choice in their lives and they can begin to act in better ways for themselves? Because they're going to be the democratic citizens for tomorrow. They need to have agency. They also need to understand how they're inscribed. And there are many other things. Yeah? But this is nothing new. This is nothing new. Nothing new. Here's an example of a body culture history. Bess Menzendijk, Western proto-feminist body culture pioneer, wrote in 1906 already about the importance of moving the pelvis back and forth. And Feldenkrais studied already in the 1920s, someone who taught the Menzendijk system. 1906, she writes about body culture for women. Liberate yourself from patriarchal, repressive body coding. She says, nobody thinks about body culture as duty. Isn't body a natural construct? Isn't body just natural? What does it have to do with culture? And then she says, the body suffers through the influence of culture, but we also have agency. It can be perfected or improved. I mean, she talks very much about perfection, so there's a body fascism in there, and this is like mainland China, dance culture. Everything has to be beautiful. All the time, everything is about beauty. You can only do beautiful things. Oh, if you don't do beautiful things, that's really, you're not going to get the funding. And the Tibetan dancers, the really ugly dancers, we made them now really beautiful. I've seen the presentations of the Chinese dance scholars who talked about that. We danced them, beautified, new Tibetan folk dancers in front of me. They're beautiful. We liberated them. Because beforehand they were ugly like this, they were just different. So maybe we don't want perfection, but that the body is a cultural construct and that we are agents in culture is really important for me. This discourse on the body. There is, of course, a whole big field of study on embodiment and cognition, embodied cognition, starting perhaps most directly here with Francesco Varela, Ian Thompson, Rush, 1990, who talk about the embodied cognition of the human mind. That consciousness and mind is always embodied. It doesn't exist, the brain doesn't work without the body. But not only that, it's also enacted and environmental, but I'll talk about it in a second. So, and there are people now in the acting world, for example, who talk about embodied action. We use these concepts, and I use them in my teaching, of course, as well, to say that conceptual thought is not separate from the body. We need to, as artists, as performing artists, we're thinking through the body, and we're influencing thought through the body. And of course, in the West, we have traditionally in the last 500 years, 400 years, a body-mind split, a dualism there that goes through modernist and postmodern civilization. And one of the quests as researchers and pedagogues is, particularly in the performing arts, is how do we arrive back at a unity? not a totality necessarily, but a unity and a connectivity and a dialogue, a dialogic understanding of the world, and a unified understanding of body-mind, so that the mind is understood as an embodied process of feeling, thinking, sensing, and acting. It's at least, and that's what also Feldenkrais says, that they're all together, these things. They have to be together. We just separate them because we can. So, and again, that's nothing new. Already in the 1920s, Konstantin Stanislavski, who was the father of Russian modernist acting, spiritual realism, he talks about this unity or totality of one's inner being and feeling. So Stanislavski, who we often think about as psychological realism, actually was very much interested in working through the body. He says the physical action is easier to grasp than a psychological attitude. It is more accessible than an elusive inner feeling, blah, 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 blah. A physical action is connected with all the other elements. And Feldenkrais knew already about Stanislavski through friends of his in the 1920s. He says what Feldenkrais says 50 years later. And so truly there's no physical action without a will. This is still the culture, patriarchal culture of the will, but let's just use the word self. Then it's easier with a will towards it, the direction, and use of the imagination. There's no action without an inner self. All this testifies to an intimate link between physical action and the totality of one's inner being and feeling. So these practitioners already in the 1920s or before that were thinking about embodiment in order to access our creaturely reality. Our creaturely reality. And of course, later, more recent kind of ideas about cognition are, in the field of enactivism, enactive cognition, enactive perception, cognition, and the creation of meaning in the world. Basically, they're saying are grounded in and shaped by the dynamics of the embodied interactions between the living organism and its environment. We are interactive beings. Our embodiment in relationship to my ground, to my other people, to my hearing the bird out there, to the warmth that's around me, to the way I am with other people. We're always relational, and we're enacting our reality in the embodied way. So neuroplasticity researcher and rehabilitation researcher Michael Merznick says, our brain is constantly changing by what we do. Our brain is plastic, and what we do really matters. Not what we are physically, what we do really matters. It's existentialism, just rewritten again. Because what we do represents the basis for the creation of the person who we are. We are in creation and we are creating ourselves. So there are many people who talk about this, and he says many other very interesting things. It's an interview about the Feldenkrais. And we have, of course, in the dance arena, we have many, we have a whole field of study, dance and cognition. They're wonderful researchers who work in dialogue with scientists, or who are scientists themselves or philosophers. Here Alva Noy, philosopher, who calls his work enactivism as well, in a talk at Tanzkongress Hamburg called Bringing the World in Dance into Focus. He says things like consciousness is in context. And we are in the world and are of the world. Consciousness is enacted. And he talks about the choreographer as engineering the determining conditions of personhood. Because the choreographer deals with gravity, fleshiness, shape, space, rhythm. All these things Feldenkrais talks about, he calls orientation. And they are the determining conditions of personhood. And consciousness, he talks as a skillful exploration of the environment. This is also what, it's like 100% Feldenkrais. This is very much a somatic paradigm. And why else would somatic education be important? the philosopher Edgar Morin, the eco-philosopher Edgar Morin, and film critic Edgar Morin, in his study financed by UNESCO, 7 complex lessons in an education for the future, basically says that in our world, which is a world of polycrisis, a crisis of separation and racism, a crisis of technology, a crisis of ecology, global ecology, a crisis of economy. Who are we as digital beasts, as hybrids? And that the study of hominization has to be at the heart of all education. The study of who we are as becoming human beings. The human condition should be an essential aspect, subject of all education, he says. And of course that embodiment and movement, somatics, all these things must really be part of this. The human condition is a combination of animality and humanity. So just the study of that combination through embodiment is I think, is a kind of a brilliant kind of place to start with. Any level of education. An awareness of the common condition of all human beings, the very rich and the diversity of individuals, and so on. As citizens of the earth, as citizens of the earth. Not only global citizens, but as citizens of this planet. How do we, the research into what our nature is perhaps more and more important as creatures who destroy our own nature and other creatures' nature. So there are many people who talk about, not only is embodiment important, but they talk about the need for re-embodiment of the world. Re-embodiments. Because what they say is that the grand narrative of modernist colonialism, modernist slavery, modernist industrialization, modernist so-called development and postmodern development is disembodiment. Our narrative over the last 500 years is disembodiment of the world. Ecocide, genocide, racism, and oppression, slavery, female genital mutilation, you name it. Terror, the terror of the gadget, the terror of the mobile phone for young kids. Where 30% of my students have mental health problems. They do this and they fall over and they just can't get up anymore because something's not wired into the brain. Because when they're 2 years old, they already have an iPhone 11. They should only have an iPhone 5. It's so wrong. Yeah? So they talk about the need for re-embodiment of the world. There are philosophers who argue that this is urgent in the world, that we re-embody our culture again, because we're on our way out otherwise. And a new alliance between the science, the humanities, and the arts, which must strive for a re-embodying of humanity as part of the eco-cultural transformation, part of and responsible for the future of nature, and responsible for the resilience and vitality of our social and ecological communities. How do we construct and reconstruct our resilience, our vitality? Are we happy still listening to that? It's okay. So obviously there's this whole field which is out there for grabs. In theory, in practice, in arts, in medical, whatever, the field of somatics. And somatics, that field has existed for many years, in many different cultures. It's not a new field. But in terms of when it was kind of coined, and phenomenologist Thomas Kampe talks already in the 1970s in the United States about somatology, a field he wants to establish or wants to articulate that he calls somatology, not phenomenology, but somatology. And hence also a lot of the understanding of somatics is really phenomenology of the body. He says somatics is the field which studies the soma, namely the body as perceived from within by first-person perspective. We're coming back to the self. The use of the word the self all the time is trying to bring us back to first person perspective. That means it's a wonderful experience, and it's also a responsibility that I then have. I have a responsibility for my life, how I'm ethically interacting with everyone. Because I have experienced it. I'm constantly in touch with my first person perception, and after a while the penny drops, so I actually have a bit of responsibility in my life. And he talks about, so I'm concerned with the inner relational process between awareness, biological function, and the environment, understood as a synergetic whole. And he was a Feldenkrais practitioner, and Feldenkrais already sets this out. Awareness, biomechanics, biological functioning, and our relationship to the environment. Not becoming a monad, not becoming artistic in a way, culturally artistic, but we are opening ourselves out to being able to relate to the world. Feldenkrais used this term self-activation somewhere. One of his articles, which is in his book, 2010, that somatics is concerned with self-activation, whatever that might mean, whatever self might mean, but that it's not just, we are looking at agency in somatics, a process of self-activation. So, somatic practices have a long-standing history of application and development within dance training and dance making context. Many people have written about this. Somatic practices developed through modern dance practices, alongside modern practices. Proto-somatic practices influenced modern dance practices. Best Mensendijk developed that pelvic seesaw movement that then becomes the brain contraction. Not that movement. That she doesn't allow that movement. That's bad. It's not pretty. It's not good. This is what dirty people do. So that's not in the brain contraction. That's in the brain. Okay. So, but it doesn't come from the brain contraction. It comes from a proto-somatic practice, for example. So there's a whole link between somatic practices and dance. And in his early writings, Thomas Kampe talks about somatic culture. What could a somatic culture be? A culture which encourages sensing, encourages the kind of sensory perception that is not primarily environmentally oriented, not only outwards and goal-oriented, but it's a sensory perception that is proprioceptive. It is about self-sensing, organismic sensing. It's a culture which encourages taking time to sense and perceive your own bodiness. I could show now the other presentation and show you work I did in the 1980s, body art work which were all about self-sensing. It's strange, I didn't know this was a whole field of study. I thought that was more original. So I see this, somatics now also, and generally as a critical resource, which allows, it's critical resources which allow participants to develop greater self-awareness, agency, and autonomy and choice-making. And there are many people who've written about this and who advocate this. Feldenkrais also suggests that somatics as a resource for autonomy and agency. Connecting to the self, Sarah Watley says, somatic practice also seeks to cultivate awareness of the self within the world, in relationship to our environment. So there are many people now who write also, there's a trend now to look beyond my own flesh in somatic practices. And writers like Natalie Garrett-Brown, who talks about somatic informed dance practices, claims that somatic practices hold a political potential within dance studies because they're concerned with an emergent dancing subject and the empowerment of the emergent dancing subject, because they question the authority of spectatorship, because it's not, what I do is not about what it looks like. I don't do this to please the audience, I don't do this for beauty. I do this from my own sensory experience. Questions the authority of spectatorship. How else can we be art participants if we don't spectate? Through feeling, sensing, and other ways. And it adopts a slow ontology that challenges dominant Western more and faster ideologies for reflective embodied criticality of the participants. It's a marginalized practice. It's a practice that questions dominant ways of being. Visuality, gaze, patriarchal gaze, it empowers the subject, and it's about slowing down. So Peter Hudson says in a chapter that we're just publishing, somatic theory and practice have shifted from focusing largely on inner experience to embracing a more macro socio-political perspective. It's here. And she talks about here this new emerging social somatic theory. So many people are now testing this work out in socially applied practices. I can give you all this as well. You can get that whole presentation, by the way. So you'll have that. Yeah? There's no question about that. And there's a general shift that moves outwards from the micro to the macro. I'll give you some examples here. Rhiannon Anderson in 2008 calls for a practice she calls critical somatics. There's also the well-being somatics and the hedonist somatics who do contact improvisation in Goa, and they do contact improvisation in Bali, and they're white people doing things in cultures of brown people. For very cheap money they do this. And, that's not what this is. It's not white well-being, white male well-being, something else. So that a discipline that we need to develop, a discipline for the students to develop an increased awareness of the relationship between one's mode of bodily comportment, social, cultural institutions, and the limitations and possibilities for choice and change on both personal and social levels. So she calls also for an integration of critical theory, critical social theory into somatic studies, which I 100% agree with. So how can we challenge and disrupt what Cornelius Castoriadis called the dominant social imaginary, dominant self-image? The kind of behavior, the very operation of this society is constantly tending to produce and reproduce. How can we as artists, or should we as artists be the spanner in the works? Not just reproduces the status quo all the time. Can this kind of work help us to be an intervention in this, to disrupt dominant social imaginary? And there are many people who now engage with what we could call somatic activisms. Rhiannon Firth here writes about, we need to understand the body as a utopian site of resistance. Not only where oppression, inequality, and affective control are played out, felt and embodied, but where we can also resist. That site of resistance. Utopian site of resistance. Here's an example of Elizabeth Benke, phenomenologist. She calls her work a somatic activism. She works with embodiment work for women victims of violation. And she has this technique, here she developed this technique of 4 approaches to empowerment of participants. First of all, to facilitate the ability to initiate a very movement. Get your participants the ability to initiate and vary movements so they feel good about themselves. They feel they can. I can move. I can initiate movements. I have agency. Number 2, enabling responsibility for one's own habitual ways of making a body by consciously accessing habituated, or what she calls sedimented movement patterns from within. To learn to read and understand your patterns and to be able to change your patterns. I am crooked that way. I have scoliosis in this way. I tend to stick my bum out a lot. It's okay. No one's perfect. I don't need to perfect myself. But I know that's what I'm doing. And sometimes I can take responsibility for it and change it. Or when my girlfriend talks to me in stupid ways, after a while I said, hang on a second, I don't feel good about this. I don't want to be in an abusive relationship. I feel it here. I take responsibility for feeling that here, and I say, stop. It doesn't work like this. Yeah? So learning to understand your own patterns and taking responsibility for it. And she then talks about facilitating a healing bodily relationality through lived experience of ground, environment, and gravity. How do I make people feel at home again in their material environment? Ground, space, that's okay. I'm in a good place. And to cultivate a kinesthetic reflexivity of the how of the action, quality of the action. I understand that this is too hard. I understand that, well, this feels really good now. When I feel like noodle soup in my ribs, when it feels like seaweed and soft noodle soup in my ribs, it feels really good. And then when it feels like old bread in my ribs, it feels really bad. Ooh la la. And there are other people who are not in the dance field at all. This is a group of transdisciplinary group called the Nanopolitics Group. Nanopolitics Group in the UK. They brought up a Nanopolitics handbook. They're people who do embodiment practices out in the environment and in cities, in London and in Barcelona and in Madrid and in Paris. They said we ask questions concerned with the lived, moving, slowed down, de-individualized, relational, caring body. It's a question of self-care and of resistant outer voices. They say the body is active, political, it moves, pulls other bodies along, it is capable of affecting and being affected. Yet this is equally a terrain of struggle, as the body is rendered hyperactive in the neoliberal world. Neoliberal capitalism desperately needs liberated bodies that are creative, flexible, and productive. These are bodies that are ready to cope with the unforeseeable, with risk, with stress, with danger. How then to reactivate, politicize, de-traumatize these struggles, how to de-individualize the defeats and conformances of our bodies have suffered. How to free our body from the repression of wage labor, how to open up our vulnerabilities to each other in ways that can counter both the threats to the stability of ourselves and the pressure of having to be and perform as working supermen and working superwomen. How are our bodies engaged and produced in current struggles? And an undoing, and I published a journal for Dance and Somatic Practice volume together with Kirsty Alexander, which we call Bodily Undoing, about critical practice. How can an undoing and reshaping of our bodies have an impact on an undoing and reshaping of our subjectivities? How we feel, how we think, how we behave with one another. How can we learn to support, sustain, and take care of each other? As a kind of political kind of inflection of questions, that's cultural questions regarding around the body. And that brings us, of course, to dance people who have been the late Jill Clark, who was one of the leading dancers in the UK. Unfortunately, she died when she was 53 after a long battle of cancer. She just was fed up at some point and stopped taking the medication. So she just died within 2 weeks. I'm increasingly excited, she writes, about the contributions dancers do and could make within our various communities, not only as performers, but as harborers of embodied knowledge, traders in mindful motion, facilitating experiences rather than delivering consumable goods. We're back at the first quote with Geza Zima, who talked about how art forms the social through and through, and that we have something to offer in the world that goes beyond just consumable, pretty-looking goods. We are constantly nurturing and researching and exploring and probing and developing knowledges which are of value to the world. And it's intangible cultural heritage, or it is maybe tangible. So just to conclude this first part of the lecture, so there are obviously many organizations now in the arts which are concerned with embodiment and the kind of cultural and critical perspectives on embodiment. Here is a wonderful resource which I'll see whether I can get into briefly, by Vida Mitchell from Middlesex University and Jane Bacon from the University of Chichester. They were part of a scene. Just need to get that. So, any questions so far, so good? Is that okay to have so many words? Yes.
Because this is it's kind of a quite complicated trajectory of the involvement of how the concept of body and the embodiment discourses have been evolving in the European, not only academy but also the practice field, especially dance field. So could you maybe kind of summarize a little bit for us how what is the key kind of concepts or key elements that have been kind of transforming in this very many schools of thoughts, and because obviously because you talk about the body culture in the early 20th century, and that was very prominent in Germany, especially in the body culture practices, not just among the dance people, but also among many common folks, different, even in different political like inclination groups. So I'm just very curious about how the body has been perceived in all these transformations, and because this what is really good that there are so many references and so many very insightful concepts that maybe just suddenly.
So I mean, I think for me, what kind of for me, it's what's relevant about all of this is kind of our notions of empowerment, our notions of the empowered subject, and the empowered subject through empowered and empathetic subject through embodied learning processes. And we have, as you said, we have had in the early 20th century, we've had body culture systems in the West which were reform, we call them reform gymnastics, which were concerned with re-educating, reforming culture through movement practices, because in industrial Western cultures that people became disembodied, and many people felt people became disempowered. The average citizen and the average worker is disempowered through the workplace and through the way culture has developed. And we need practices to allow us to unfold to our fuller potential, and also to empower individuals and to empower communities. Those were practices that were developed from late 19th century until the 1930s in Europe. A lot of these people then went to the United States, went to England, went to Australia, went to lots of Western places, and started to further develop these practices, which then later became part of what we now call somatic practices. So the Feldenkrais, for example, was influenced by the Menzies work, by Alexander work, by Jacobi Gindler work. He was influenced to a great extent by these practices. He just doesn't write about it, but he was influenced by it. And many other contemporary somatic practices were influenced by these early body cultures, which were about a lot of empowerment of women. And the whole reason why dance education became established in higher education, university system, was not to train dancers, I'm sorry, it's to empower women. That's why these courses were set up in higher education, some in conservatoires as well, but to bring a poetic and strong body culture as an educational tool to empower women students in theory practice, and that's why it became so popular in America and the United States, and maybe here too. Then, of course, in 1960s, 70s, 80s, we have the whole inflection of feminisms, of French feminisms, American feminisms, other feminisms, and we now have aspects of, we're looking at decolonizing the classroom. We're looking at decolonizing practices through embodied practices. I'm not so involved in that because I'm white male and I have my own history to bear, my own white burden to bear in that way. But there is a feminist and post-colonial strand that kind of looks at somatic practices as critical practices and practice of empowerment. Yes, what I'm trying to say is what interests me is the cultural, social, and critical inflection on practices of embodiment, rather than just to leave it at we're going to look at dance and cognition, embodiment and neurocognition, and I'm more interested in the kind of critical field. That kind of makes sense. So here's a little resource which is, I can't see, but that's interesting. Trying to just get into the home page of this. So this is a resource that was recently developed by Jane Bacon and Vida Mitchell and other colleagues, which is it's a resource called Artistic Doctorates in Europe. And it's an open access journal type of publication that has a variety of essays in there. This is the essay area that deals with somatics, embodiment, and subjectivity from a broad range of perspectives. Mostly always brought back to creative practice. Different writers coming from different perspectives. So Adeshola Akinele is an African-British choreographer and dance maker who works on queer practices and embodiment, and so she writes from her perspective. Jane Bacon writes very much about articulating artistic processes, and so it's both of them. So Jane Bacon and Vida both write about how we articulate creative processes, and I'm in there myself too with a small essay called Bodies on myself. So just as an example of a publication that's around there. So here's another example of a group of diverse people trying to make sense of embodiment and corporeality. Here's the text. It's a research group at Bath Spa University, which I'm co-directing with a colleague called Mary Stedman. This interdisciplinary research group explores the body as a resource of creative material and notions of embodiment in cultural context. So we're looking at how the body is cultured and cultures and creative corporalities. It's an interdisciplinary research group that responds to a contemporary revision of notions of humanity, felt both viscerally and intellectually for which the predominant answer is embodiment and creativity. That's what we're proposing. Whether that is the answer, I don't know. That's the answer we want to propose. So here is our website, Creative Cooperatives Research Group. We've just had, so here again it talks about us, what we do, where we're embedded in, and we've just had a workshop with Lena Batson on her eco-somatic practices, human origami, the folding and continuum of human environmental life. And Lena was with us for 3 weeks, kind of advising colleagues and coming to teach for us and co-presenting with me and running workshops and so on. So she's a kind of senior person from the United States. We have had all sorts of events which are not there on there anymore. They always get them out once they're done. They have them. The next thing coming up that we have is a lecture performance by Rosalind Crisp. Rosalind Crisp is a leading environmental activist, dance activist from Australia, improviser and very interesting pedagogue and very interesting performer and comedian in a way. But she has this project called Dirt that will come out, and so she is very much into looking at environmental devastation in Australia and working through dance activism with various communities in responding to environmental crisis. We have, there she is, Rosalind on the burnt tree. Fantastic book. One of our professors has been editing. Professor of environment and culture, so we're trying to really link up with other departments, with environmental humanities also. This is a book in contributions to law, philosophy and ecology, exploring re-embodiments. It's re-embodiment, what I talked about earlier on, as a preliminary contribution to the establishment of re-embodiments as a theoretical strand within legal and ecological theory and philosophy. So these are people who are trying to bring embodied understanding of the world into law, into philosophy, and into ecology. She's one of our researchers. Very interesting work. He's a member of our research group, and he is a lecturer in media studies, and he has a walking practice. He does guided tours. Alternative guided tours. He has a whole series of tours on slavery, on hidden histories in the United Kingdom, and exposing difficult, reluctant and hidden histories through embodied participatory processes. So he takes people for walks to these pretty places which were owned by slave owners, and the stories of oppression are being told in these harsh, white, supremacist places, and amongst other things that he does. And he affiliates himself to also somatic. He tries to now articulate his practice through somatic practices, because he came from a really heady theoretical background, and now he really works through embodiment and sees his whole work functioning through embodiment, kinesthetic empathy, and so on and so on. Just so quickly here, this is a research journal volume that I've been recently editing for the International Feldenkrais Federation, the Feldenkrais Research Journal, and volume 6. Again, it's an open access journal, really important. This has taken us 3 years. This was supposed to be a 1-year project to get practitioners to write, get practitioners to articulate their concerns, and through writing, and Feldenkrais practitioners, so somatic practitioners who are concerned with artistic contexts. Anyway, it doesn't matter, we don't need to look at it. It's there as a resource now, where we have about 13 articles where practitioners who work in the arts, sorry, to retrieve it again, Feldenkrais practitioners who work in the arts write about their practice. Some of it quite theoretical, some of it really kind of rigorous kind of pedagogical research, some of it more or less just process descriptions, but uttering, beginning to articulate their concerns, their findings, and their problems. Now, Volume 6 offers a critical forum for scholarship, articulation, and evaluation of creative practices and pedagogies which are informed by the Feldenkrais method. And again, I find it really important that we construct kind of forums for dialogue, that we create research communities where people really articulate their concerns and share their concerns, and we learn from each other. Here's another International Federation for Theatre Research has an embodied research working group, and they have a mission statement. Again, one can join them. It supports research concerned with embodied practice as an explicit part and essential part of their methodology. Researchers who want to make embodiment part of their methodology, how do we develop networks so we begin to understand each other and learn from each other. While embodiment has been a major interest for theatre and other scholars across several decades at least, the claim that embodied practice can constitute a model method of academic research is relatively new, as we know, and in some contexts still considered controversial. And these guys have brought out, they found some major funding to get the Somatic Toolkit resource. Here's another interesting journal of embodied research, also an interesting resource to access. Won't open it right now. I guess what I'm interested in with this, to come back to your question, what holds it kind of all together, is a kind of transdisciplinary approach to arts research through embodiment. Henk Bogdorf writes about that the type of artistic research that combines aesthetic, product, and creative process with questions and topics from broader areas of life. What does this mean in the world, what I do? And may be characterized as transdisciplinary research if the synthesis achieved in the artwork is something additionally or different to offer, both conceptually or perceptually, the outcome that would have resulted from a single disciplinary approach. So how do we articulate what the work also means in the work? I'll use some of the slides of this other presentation. It's another presentation just to have a bit more pictures to begin with. And so just to say, as I said before, I come from a visual theatre, dance and live art background, so it's been interdisciplinary. Here's a piece of digitally coordinated choreography I did in Sao Paulo in 2001 with visual artist Laura Belém. I did all the digital programming, and we kind of choreographed some clothing and some things through inflatable figures, choreography for inflatable figures, which was running in a gallery just as a choreographic installation. Let me just get rid of that. It's just not relevant. So physicalization. I used to be a dancer and an actor, and I got fantastic feedback always on the physicalization, on the embodiment of the practice. That was my selling point, if you wish to talk capitalist way. And that was also what made them. I was interested, and I was interested in pushing the theatrical pieces through embodiment. We created lots of physical theatre work. And my research focus, when I was employed at first at universities, was twofold. One, the body and performance. I always had that, the body and performance, body perspective on performer training, performance making, and the second one. Sorry, I'll move on from there. The second one I called choreography and context. So on the one hand, I was doing these things kind of choreographically here and choreography in context here, using choreographies in plays. This was a play I directed, using choreographic devices, choreographic strategies to work with digital media and in theatre contexts and so on and so on. So I did all this applied choreography research, plus research into the body and performance. At some point, I also started to bring those together. Yeah? So I worked for 20 years with this company, Pascal Theatre Company, really creating work that questions, challenges, representations of race, gender and social identity, work that embraces issues of cultural diversity in a British contemporary and European context. That was the professional practice, but it was also inquiry-based, it was also research-based. And again, more interesting things here is an example of a piece I did in 2012 where I worked, this was a transdisciplinary heritage arts project in relation to recorded transcripts by high-ranking World War II prisoner of wars interned in Trent Park, where Middlesex University was, and between 1943 and 1945, and we did this immersive performance. I directed this immersive performance event, and really looking at embodiment there. What's the embodied experience of these people in this space, with that lighting, in that proximity? Or what sort of stories are we telling here in these oppressed spaces in the basement? So I created this whole experience for the audience by creating a guided tour, and that guided tour would be choreographic through the building. And the story would be told, embedded into this embodied experience of the spectator. So here were stories told, the audience standing really close around it. This is a guy who performs a story of a general, World War II general, who witnesses mass shootings and atrocities, and it looks like an execution with chamber, and he comes out and he transforms into someone else, and he tells another story, and he falls down, and he's being carried away he dies, and he's being carried away by some nurses. Or we place people here as kind of emigrant people behind curtains during lectures, and we looked at where do we place bodies in space. This was kind of part of the artistic project. Or this was a choreography by a young black African British dancer with metal-studded shoes on a glass and metal roof. Someone would tell a story from above, a war story. The audience, mainly Holocaust survivor children, would come down there. She would be kind of stumbling and falling, and it would make a noise. The noise would be amplified by a sound artist into the basement where another story is told at the same time. Yeah? So we'd had three groups, one in the rooftop, one in the middle, one in the basement. And they'd see each other, they'd move around each other, so all these bodies moving around each other and witnessing each other simultaneously, using montage and choreographic strategies. How do we merge here this body-mind environment unity? How do we bring the body into a very grim environment and tell story here? Here we told stories about prisoners. It was just, she was a Polish student, so she talked in Polish, of course. Yeah? And we used the atmosphere, the feeling that this work was creating. Here, someone with a fire burning on her head and so on. Just go through that. Here's another project I did with a company of non-disabled and disabled participants, people with disabilities and non-disabilities. We looked at training, ways of kind of bringing disabled and non-disabled people together and training together and making work together. So we came up with this very strange choreographic structure of strings, and I worked with my brother who was a professor for design, and we designed this space with these big strings, and they would all get entangled. By the end of it, one of the disabled performers was climbing on it and singing a song. So we were doing all this kind of entangling with this mentally disabled and learning disability students and non-disabled students. entangled, creating these kind of some songs where you really empower, and this guy is just singing these extraordinary stories. There's a wonderful picture I think coming out. Or here we're doing these guided tours. Here one of the disabled people takes a non-disabled person around, and we're taking care of each other here in maybe non-traditional ways. This way, and we move together, and we touch, and then we created this installation. This was this entangled space that we built together with, as an artistic object with the group of performers. One of the many things. It's just an example of some of the practice I've been involved with. So, to cut that short, I had all these kind of interdisciplinary arts experiences, and I did a PhD. My prior publication, so I made all the work and then I wrote it up and turned it into a PhD. Called The Art of Making Choices, the Feldenkrais Method as a Choreographic Resource. Concerned with the application and resonances of the Feldenkrais Method within performance-making context. There's been a lot of research about performer education and training. No one had done any research about how do we place this in a making context. And I thought, that's great, that's what I'm going to do. Here's my originality. Yeah? Because for a PhD, you obviously need to do something more original. And so what were my aims? To develop tools for critical and collaborative practice. I'm a critical person, I'm a 21st century person. I believe in criticality, questioning, and collaboration. That is accessible and also non-normative. And kind of looking at Emily Clay's ideas here about integrating dancers as thinking bodies, really intelligent. How do we activate and integrate the intelligence of the dancers in the choreographic process? And what sort of methodology can I develop to empower the performer to participate in the creation of the performance? So those were kind of the bigger part of the bigger aims of the research. Simple. And so the research project was, the overall research had the practical projects, articles that I wrote, and I'd never written anything. Oh my God, I couldn't write a paragraph, and then I wrote articles. I just did it. I rose to the challenge, and that was really great. And then I wrote another one. And then I revamped the one and wrote it better, and so on. I learned that. There were some performative research submissions. The first research I put in there was a professional piece which I made with 150 people in a football stadium. Large-scale sign-responsive choreography was commissioned by dance organizations with the St. Pauli football stadium as a professional partner and other professional partners. It set out the theme. Here was the first time where I explored how do I use Feldenkrais method in a project, in a process. I realized that's what I was doing. So in this project, I began to discover what my practice is, or what I would like to do next. And there were professional partners there, both regular dance company, the football club, architects, and so I drew on Feldenkrais my ideas of micro-narratives and perspectives of difference and self, and we used Laban's movement choirs and so on to stage this in a contemporary context. Here are the football hooligans doing their choreography. That was their choreography. The first rule of the Feldenkrais method is that there's no rule. First principle is that there's no principle. Anything is possible. This was possible. Yeah? So they had, and I had a guy sitting there with me, big guy, crying afterwards. I can't believe this, I can't believe this. Why are you crying? Because I'm an artist. I didn't know I was an artist. It's the first time we were ever recognized. They were singing and showing their fire choreographies and as part of this big event. I thought, yeah, great, this is nice. And this was a group of women who really constructed these really simple things. We reduced things to a minimum. So So we put just these pedestrian practices into just a male-dominated, patriarchal spectacle place. We did the anti-spectacle. We just stood and walked, and women holding hands and walking, and standing, and sinking down into the floor and falling down and getting up. Simple things. 500 people in the audience there, 800 people in the audience, and they're just standing there, just holding hands and just doing simple rituals. And we also integrated different groups here, a girls' football club, an old-age pensioner dance group, and how do I, and what can I, and I realized actually what I do with the Feldenkrais method, that kind of openness and that ability to be creative and ability to observe and to respond really helped me to make this piece. So this was the piece that helped me to begin what my research would be. This was a piece, this was a part of the piece, a man with a dog, to Elvis playing double speed and You'll Never Walk Alone. Yeah? And then the guy just walks with the dog across the whole football field, and the dog stops, the guy stops. 800 people watching, he just stands there, the dog stands there, then they move on. And it was beautiful, it was extremely poetic. And again, this Feldenkrais stuff, reducing the stimulus, bringing things really down to nothing. And then suddenly doing something really, wow, energetic and strong, integrated. And so that was followed then by 4 laboratory projects where I tested, probed, and listened to the discoveries that were emerging. I called them Body, Soma, Self. And it was undertaken at first to address questions that came up in the first project. Oh wow, I used this Feldenkrais stuff, and now what else can I do with it? So here is just one of the projects called Chaser with Colin Poole and dancer and Jenny Lam, Hong Kong Chinese and black British choreographer working together. So there were 4 projects. First one, Chaser, which was done, a laboratory project done in collaboration with the Feldenkrais Guild Germany. It was performed at the German Guild conference. And I'll say it straight away, really important that all of these projects were made in association with professional partners, or with informed peers. That was my quality control. And that's what Henk Bogdorf calls the solidarity of, or the quality control of peers. I didn't just do this with my mates, I did this with organizations who are knowledgeable, who can feed back on me, because I need feedback to make my work better. The second piece was called Trace Reverse. Dances for 6 dancers. We had funding from Chisenhale Dance Space in London and showed it at the 2nd European Feldenkrais Congress. Just a studio-based exploration, but again, made in collaboration with informed partners, where we perform it, we get feedback, we show it, we think about it, oh, this could be different, and so on. The first one was concerned with just developing vocabularies. How do I develop vocabulary, material for dance, out of the Feldenkrais method? The second one was, how do I take that material into choreographic structure? What are the compositional elements in the Feldenkrais method? Repetition and variation, reversal, ABA rondo structures, and so on and so on and so on. Restriction, constraints, letting go of constraints. What sort of compositional modalities do we use? And what happens if I use these things here in the process? Now, the third one, Crossing, was done in collaboration with Escapade International Improvisation Festival, London Metropolitan University, and the Michael Chekhov Acting Center. Michael Chekhov was a physical theater pioneer. And here I really looked at that question that you asked, Sean, how do I take this impressive, rather depressive Feldenkrais practice that's all internal and small, how do I take that out and make something large out of it? What happens if I become angry with this? What if we take this impressive practice into an expressive, an extreme practice? And I use physical theater approaches, Grotowski, and impulse work, Michael Chekhov work, and and lab and effort work, what if I blend that now? I cross the borders. I stop just being pure Feldenkrais. Bugger, I don't want to do that. It's too boring. My students walk out of the door if I do pure Feldenkrais. It's too uninteresting. I'm sorry. We've moved on. Yeah? So how do I need to find, I tested the boundaries here. And then the last one, let me say it this way. In these two projects, I was a technocrat. How can I develop vocabulary? How can I develop structure? I was objective, hard-nosed, observer, writing down. And here it became, hang on a second, what happens to the self of the performer? Is this really the whole self that we're performing all the time? We're talking about the Feldenkrais, or is it just a dull self? Just hanging in their self? Or what sort of self is this? Yeah? So I started to ask other questions. I started the question of what sort of person am I? Personhood question, because Feldenkrais says I work with a person. I started to ask questions concerning subjectivity. That then led me to the next collaborative project with a series of Feldenkrais practitioners, BMC practitioners, Pilates practitioners, to inquire how do we construct agency and choice making through these processes. And I didn't care about the pieces we made. I didn't even make one. I stepped back completely. I let them do, and then I just interviewed people. And it was very interesting. Yeah? So this was then all about a laboratory about, again, subjectivity and choice making. So the first project, a professional project, the next 4 projects, with other professionals and internationally renowned organizations, laboratory projects, and then the 4th project, the next project, the final project was, so here it says the content again, so I'll skip that. The last project, so overall, the research was concerned with how do we take this somatic education that deals with awareness, how do we enrich that and guide it towards expressivity, working with visceral dynamic approaches and performance modes, and also and how do we then move towards the sociality, the relationality, the conditions for co-creation in a creative process. Those were the kind of questions that I was asking. So the final project I did in 2010 was to work for 3 weeks on movement direction for a professional project which I had been in a performer 10 years before that, the recreation of a project where I would work for 40 minutes up to 3 hours a day with actors doing Feldenkrais and contact and Feldenkrais and touch explorations in a creative process, and then rehearse. And then we did a 3 weeks tour, 3 weeks sold out run of that place. So we put the research elements and the research findings, we tested them again in a professional context. Professional piece as a source for discovery, laboratory pieces to now develop confidence and to develop the processes, then put it into practice tested there. This is too boring. So, professional product, laboratory project, improved professional product. Typical Feldenkrais thing. Do something, walk, explore something new, walk again, oh, walking feels much better. Yeah? It's an ABA variation research design, with lots of feedback loops in between of reading, researching, writing, publishing, discussing, giving papers, and so on. Here were a few, these were 2 papers I wrote there, and then afterwards I wrote lots of stuff. And I wrote them really for myself, to learn to articulate what my concerns are. What's the research rationale? What were my findings? Was I really truthful? Again, what Borgdorf calls, there needs to be a quality assurance in our work. Quality assurance was here through a forum of equals. I was working with established other performers, choreographers, as an extended peer review all the time, with people who I could trust or who didn't know me, and where I could have these feedback mechanisms. And of course then there was all the work in how do I evidence this, because it's process. A lot of what the research is product, but really a lot of what the research was about processes. How do I evidence the processes through questionnaires, through writing project texts, through video documentation, getting reviews for things, and also in the end to write my exegesis. So I had to write not a thesis, but what we call an exegesis. It's a document, a critical analysis of your practice. So the practice comes first in this practice-led research. That's the brunt of the work, and then I need to analyze the practice, contextualize it, theorize it, analyze it, and understand what was emerging, what were the boundaries. So in the exegesis, I needed to ask all sorts of questions. What am I researching? Why am I researching? What's the concepts and what are the ideologies? What's the Feldenkrais method? What is that? That took me a long time to do. Even though I was a Feldenkrais practitioner, this took me, this was the hardest thing for me, to find out what is this really doing. What field am I located in? Oh my God. And then I suddenly found out, oh, field of somatic informed dance practice is great. And who else is, who are my peers? Who writes about this? What are they thinking? How was knowledge constructed? What were my processes? How do I articulate my methodology? And what were then the topics? That was the most difficult thing for me in a way, to articulate what were my findings, my topics. Subjectivity, agency, empathy. Can I really talk about these things? Because they're subjectivities, aren't they? And so actually that's what I really must write about. Not just about the vocabulary and the ABA structure and the development of motif. I need to write about, that's the subject, the personhood. Because that's what Feldenkrais, isn't that what Feldenkrais is all about, personhood? I discovered that. And then also to write about what's missing and so on and so on, yeah? So there was a lot of grinding. There's a lot of grinding. The practice is the biggest problem. Practice is already in this work is the most important thing. And then because I was a choreographer in the making, or because I worked through choreography, or because I was a choreography teacher for 25 years, I came in with a choreographic hat in, and I analyzed the Feldenkrais method through the lens of a choreographer. I understood that's the way it's constructed. I understood the body coding as polycentric and multidirectional, and I understood core initiation. I understood all these choreo things in the work. So some discoveries in there. I also discovered that the Feldenkrais method is not just a movement education, but is an emancipatory pedagogy, and it is a critical practice in my view. That I discovered that through the making, beyond making the work. I articulate that the Feldenkrais method per se is a choreographic practice. It uses everything that the choreographer uses. It uses movement, personhood, composition, reflection, self-witnessing. It uses witnessing. Yeah? So it's a choreographic process. That's why it works so well in a bigger choreographic process, because it's already choreographed. And I developed a choreographic toolkit. I developed a process of inquiry within a process of inquiry. If choreography is a process of inquiry, I developed a micro-process that can be useful in the bigger process of inquiry. Those were discoveries and also outcomes that I was able to articulate. And I'll just move on from there because it's not relevant for now. I won't say much about the Feldenkrais method because I don't want to spend the time on this. Yeah? It is a somatic practice that and uses a lot of structure. There were 5 things that were relevant for me at the end of my inquiry. Number 1, that we're working through movement. That we're inquiring personhood through movement. We're not working with movement, we're working through movement. We're inquiring something that goes beyond movement. We're working through movement. Feldenkrais's theory of reversibility were useful for me. Do one thing, try it in at least 3 different ways, and then try the opposite. Or, he says it, the first principle of my work is that there's no principle. Theory of reversibility. When you try something, you must also try the opposite. It's a dialectic way of working. And the fact that he proposes what I call a choreographic thinking, a thinking through movement. He says, I want my students to be able to think while they do, and to do while they think. I want them to think through movement. That was useful for me in the work, and I work with it. And his breaking the dualism between body and mind by proposing what he calls a fundamental unity of body, mind, and environment was an important aspect of his theory, if you wish, that allowed me to drive my practice. And the last thing, of course, which took me a long time to arrive at, is that this is about working with people. Not with choreography, not with movement, but with people through movement. And that my choreographic process also involves personhood, and that I work with people, and so on. And I started to ask questions in the choreographic process about people. This is another video. So these were just choreographic things that I wrote about, how work is constructed, and so on and so on. What sort of questions we asked. So, in the last project, I interviewed participants. I interviewed the co-director, the assistant director who participated in the workshop, and all the actors. And we got reviews for the project, which were phenomenal performance reviews, and they made so much sense. It was amazing. So, things they said, and this is actually now I'm going to go into the other presentation. Sorry to disturb this, because the other presentation has the better version of this. Before we come to the questions, so really, what a big part of my research was concerned was the transfer of the Feldenkrais method into performance-making processes. So, to put it really simple, how do we get from here, where everyone's just lying down and just these small things, and everyone's on their back, and I hold all the power, I talk all the time. Traditional mastering, the Feldenkrais method. How do we get from here, or from these lovely Korean women doing Feldenkrais, cooking, the rice, gentle exploration? How do we go from these impressive practices to this? Or to this, or to this, or to that, or to over here. How do we get from something that's just non-effective, just reflective, into something violent, powerful, expressive, and so on? That was a lot of the journey, was just probing that in the process, again and again probing it. So interesting comments from the participants. I just have a few down here. We see ourselves. What a beautiful poetic kind of thing, he says. We see ourselves through the process. Little things that have a profound effect. Wow. You're always opening new rooms in the house, opening new doors, opening new experiences. Your awareness begins like a ripple, widen, creates a kind of total awareness I found. I didn't write them. This is what the people who were in the workshops wrote. I found that extremely poetic, and I categorized this a little bit. And so my colleague Julia Pascal, who was the co-director, says the performers were co-inquirers. Were really clearly co-inquirers in your process. The performers are examining, she says. They're examining sensation, so they are using emotional and intellectual parts of the self at the same time. What you are doing is to encourage that flow, which the performers then take into rehearsal and into their performance. And that's the strongest effect I've ever seen in rehearsal, which is fantastic. I thought that was fantastic. And the performers really felt that there was a non-corrective practice of questioning that helped them to develop confidence. So I don't feel that I'm told to do anything. I feel I'm being encouraged to discover something in myself, said one of the actors. Initially there was resistance, the other one said, because I felt, can't you tell us what to do? Because we asked just questions. That's a deformation of however we've learned, but however we've been taught directly. But it worked for her. And again, Pascal said, you often ask, how does that feel? You make the person experience their own bodies as if it's a new code. And that's very exciting and makes the person realize they can expand and grow in a way they had not thought of before. I mean, this is someone who doesn't know anything about the Feldenkrais method. She just participates, and oh my God. And that questioning, which transmutes into a body change, allows the person to widen and realize they are capable of much more. Coming back to the empowerment questions, the agency questions, and she articulates that. And all sorts of discoveries, I skip that, this doesn't belong here. So people talked about how important is the awareness and enhancing capacity of the work. The movements are so gentle and bring you back into yourself, but not into yourself. It makes you aware of all your center, and then you open out, and everything is so quite gentle, so it's very specific. No movement is gratuitous. Helps to focus. I love that last sentence. You become aware of the parts of your body moving, particularly the feeling of sensation of it. You are more active. A performer should be active at all points. Boy, does that help me every day in my classroom when I work with acting students. I know why I'm saying these things to the students, and I feel I'm so much more confident as a teacher now and in the rehearsal process why I want to use this, because this guy told me something that I didn't understand. That performer should be active all the time. This activates them. Interesting. And people talked about that it was empowering to choice making in the movement design of the performance, and it was a resource for effective action where movement is impacting the emotion. Simeon Perlin said, I'm much more physical actor than I thought. I always thought that I'm a thinking, feeling actor, which is fine, but it actually works. The movement infers the emotion. Movement creates the emotion. After I've had all these interviews, I was able to write up something more clearly what my discoveries were, what this was really about. Some of this stuff I've never thought of before. When they were saying it, I thought, oh wow, this is really interesting. Let me discuss that more in my writings. People talk about liberation, stopping to censor themselves. And then the most wonderful comment, which I found really important again by Julia Pascal, it is because there is no fear. I think what you have done is eradicated fear in the rehearsal process through Feldenkrais method and play. The speed with which the performers have absorbed has translated into performance in ways I would have never thought possible. It's as if they have worked together for a year. In fact, they've only worked together for 3 weeks. So that was so exciting to get that gift through the kind of interviews and think, okay, now I'll go back and I'll write about the project. What was it? Is that true what they said? And can I write about it and why was that so? I can then ask the whys when I have all this information. And most interestingly, we got this review from a person who didn't know anything about the process. Nothing, nada, nothing. She saw it. We had the New York Times review. They were blown away. It was really exciting. This woman wrote, Thomas's use of dance and movement, how did she know I did that? I mean, she knew I was the movement director. And imbues the production with all the power of only experience. Actors don't act, they move and become. So she talks about this enactivism, this becoming through movement. The movement he creates for the actors embodies what authentic movement therapists use in their work, which is an extremely powerful modality. And I thought, yeah, she really, just this little thing here, that this woman wrote, the actors don't act, they move and become, really brought it home to me, what the work activates, this enactivism, the realism, the reality of you're accessing your identity and changing your identity through movement as an actor in this work, rather than putting on an act from outside, rather than pretending. You are truthfully embodying something, and therefore you're becoming something right in front of the performer, right in front of the audience. And again, it helps me tremendously in my teaching process with actors when I need to engage with what is this all about, what do you need to achieve, how do you become truthful in what you do. This is the latest project I've been involved with since 2014, releasing the archive. Research project with professional partners and Carol Brown, and practice-led research project using the technologies I've developed and the processes I've developed with Feldenkrais method and choreography, to reactivate and to re-somatize the choreographic practices of the Jewish modernist choreographer Gertrude Bodenwieser, practices that have nearly disappeared through the Holocaust experience. As I said, I studied with this old lady. This was her teacher. I first had the first-hand experience of getting some Bodenwieser experience through her, through my teacher who was her student. So we spent 5 years on working in collaboration with different organizations, New Zealand Dance Company, Somatic Academy, Dr. Elf Berlin, and Laure Gilbert from Paris Opera Ballet, and Gabi Aldo, international people, gathering information together as historians of how we can work with this archive material, the stuff that we know from experience, but also lots of notebooks from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, from dancers. How do we reenact this work again? Through using choreographic process and Feldenkrais method. To cut this short, we were interested in repairing and revitalizing the significance of this work because it's nearly disappeared. We raised awareness here and we retraced this kind of international journey. We were also drawing attention to the erotic, to the sexual identity. You see it. And we explored how the Feldenkrais method can be a tool. So I was at home with that. It's a difficult history because the dominant narratives are the narratives of people who collaborated with the Nazis. Wigman, Laban, many others collaborated with the Nazis. It was all whitewashed afterwards, and these people disappeared. We just had an exhibition in Vienna, and in the Vienna exhibition, there's just that much space for that choreographer. And the big Nazi collaborator has a whole room. She has the whole first room on her own. It's extraordinary. I find that despiteful. And this woman gets a wall. And we have a video, we have 2 videos in there of the work, in the exhibition of what we did, but the work's disappeared. It's shocking. Yeah? So we try to revive that, and how can we work in a contemporary way? What's the concept of, what sorts of concept can we construct of this historical work now? Here's Gertrude Bodenwieser. She was the first professor of dance, of choreography in the world. She resigns and emigrates in 1938 and pioneers modern dance in Austria, Colombia, New Zealand, and Australia. Presentations, articles, book chapters, we developed a process, we documented things, we created a live performance and 2 films. 1 film and a screen dance installation out of this material, which is now in an exhibition in Vienna, which runs for the whole year until mid-2020. Both films are in there, and we have articles in their catalog in there. So it's good. Lost and Found was an immersive piece, a little bit like the piece I showed, the guided tour piece, and about displacement. We had reviews about that. A piece about exile. I made an 8-meter high video installation based on a collage way of working with dancers with New Zealand dance company who we filmed displacing and displaying and tumbling and montaging and deconstructing and reconstructing. This was the media wall at Bath University. Really large, 30 screens of ecstatic dancing and their workshops with professionals. We reconstructed the process of Gertrude Bodenwieser. We filmed that, and again we had lots of activities there. Just show you a couple of pictures here of the work that we were interested in. Gertrude Bodenwieser, the way they're using their torso, the fact that they really have this. She talks about the torso playing the melody, everything coming from the middle, the way they touch and hold, intimacy, the use of the pelvis, body coding, same body coding as in the Feldenkrais method, sequential movement, lots of core mobility, torso playing the melody. And we had lots of material to work from, notebooks from 1930s dancers, scraps of material originating in torso, traveling out there. And lots of images. These are the typical images that struck us. This ecstatic women. This is Shona Dunlop, who just passed away in 1940, dancing Cain and Abel, dancing the murderer, the lust of the killer, the lust of killing. So all these back arches. And of course you need a pelvis for that in order to back arch. So we reconstructed this back arching and a lot of techniques. Again, we used feedback from the dancers. I felt an obvious change in different how my body worked and so on and so on. And I found both techniques to lead me to discover my possibility. I use my pelvis. So we find affinities and so on. We had this exhibition. Here's a small installation in Vienna in this exhibition right now. We had access to the Theatre Museum archives. We found much more material now about this woman. Quite extraordinary. I've just been writing a book chapter about her work in exile. But most interestingly, I discovered that there's an alternative somatic history. That Feldenkrais did not inform dance, but dance informed Feldenkrais. That Feldenkrais studied with Margaret Ornstein in the 1920s, here in the middle. I found it out through her granddaughter, Gabi, who's now in her 80s, who's a good friend. That Feldenkrais studied actually with Margaret Ornstein in the 1920s, sorry, I just looked straight away there. And that Feldenkrais talks all the time about his work, artistically, compositions, improvisations. Where did he know improvisation from? He was a builder and an engineer. He studied improvisation in the 1920s, and he studied how to move that pelvis. Yeah? So Mark Rees, in his biography, says, in one sentence, he studied ballet with Miss Ornstein. But he didn't study ballet. He studied this kind of expressionist dance practice, which was all about core mobility. And so I've been researching into this connection of Margaret Ornstein, who studies with Gertrude Bodenwieser and Bess Menzendiek, this Austrian Ausdrucksstanz gymnastic system, and what the impact was on Moshe Feldenkrais of the reform culture. He also studied with other people they're never mentioned. Usually they're women, they're not mentioned because they're women, so they won't be mentioned in the history. And so on. And you can see things like this. This is pure Feldenkrais, just by Margaret Ornstein in 1939, not in 1980 by Moshe Feldenkrais. Life is movement. Everything that lives is a continuous movement. This is just a typical propaganda from Feldenkrais, which he got from her, and she got it from Laban, and so on. So it's nothing. There is a direct link here. Gabi Aldo says, who went to these classes? Moshe Feldenkrais went to the classes there. Who wooed the Ornstein sisters. So, and we have all sorts of material there, telegrams and letters from Feldenkrais, where he writes about dance even in the 1920s. So this is a research, this is just an article that comes out now, a book chapter, where I've rewritten this part of somatic history, even taught in the 1920s, 1929 already, in the dance studio of Margaret Ornstein. We know he taught, self-defense. Yeah? But so that somatic history doesn't start in the 1950s or something. So what I'm just trying to say in a way is that I started a research with a practice that interested me, applied it to a modern dance practice, which I thought this is very similar. There are many similar ethics and similar principles in this modern dance practice, and through the practice, new historical theoretical knowledge has emerged for me because I had the research time and the research space and a bit of funding to do more researching, and something's completely changed what I'm now researching about. So that's it's an emerging process where the practice informs the theory. Literally, the practice informs the theory. Just to conclude, a couple of examples which I'll talk about tomorrow more. There are many people in other fields. This is a PhD student I'm co-supervising. He is an architect who works at Hafen City University and looking at spatial perception, body consciousness in architectural practice. Applying somatic practices. Huh? He's got a scientific interest, he's got an artistic interest, he can articulate that. Really important. And that's maybe the first thing that I was interested in. What interests you? If it doesn't interest us what we're doing, the research, it's about research interest. It has to interest us. Otherwise, who else is going to be interested in it? And he's able to, he draws diagrams really great, it's really clear where he's coming from. There's lots of stuff missing in the work, but he's able to make these links, movement, and architecture. What are we all concerned with is space. So he looks at the study of space and how architectural study can be informed through embodied practices. And he got himself a clear timeline and methodology of research labs and workshops that he's working with, and in interesting ways. So here's an example of something that he's concerned with, his research concerns. He makes these drawings, expanding the kinesphere into extrapersonal space. That will be a workshop topic. And with architect students, he surrounds himself with a forum of equals. So he does these workshops and he invites other architects into the practice. He invites leading Feldenkrais dance practitioners into the practice, and they share workshops. And so again, he does this kind of quality peer review in his process, which is quite interesting. And the last one to finish, here's a student, Thomas Kampe, practicing affectivity, a phenomenological study in the contemporary actor's expression of emotion. Another person I'm co-supervising through University of Exeter. She's got a post-colonial critical framework. I'll speak all through that. And she has things that she wants to test. It's all really clear. Performance practices. She has a methodology. She has research questions. Affectivity, embodiment, training, And she uses she says, I'm using qualitative methods focused on interviews and micro-phenomenology. It's a method. But what's missing in her research practice, in the methodology? It's a methodology concerned with practice. It's a project concerned with practice. The study of practice. Her methodology is concerned, she sets it out as qualitative methods using interviews and microphenomenology. What do we think is missing in the methodology that she could access? That would help her?
Her own practice.
Her own practice. The biggest thing she left her, she sits there with me for an hour and think, God, what's missing? Why does she not honor herself? Here's a mover, she goes studying for months, she knows all these practices backwards. And that's not her processes, her workshops, her own learning, they're not part of the practice. She just goes into these frameworks that are outside of her. So we negotiated that how can her own learning and practice, maybe workshops and rehearsals with actors, and a somatic framework as a theoretical framework, maybe that's much better for her research and gives a more truthful and more multidimensional knowledge, it cleans that knowledge, rather than just using qualitative interview methods. Does that make kind of sense? Because she feels she's forced to do that, because her supervisor in the other university is not a practitioner. Because I've had the experience of, okay, we can do practice, I was able to advise her like this. So now in our symposium on embodied learning, she applies confidently, and she applies a little workshop on eye training and embodied imagination, and she then is beginning to use her workshop practice as a research practice. She tests that by doing that at a conference. So she puts it out there, she writes it, what are her research concerns, she puts her practice out as a research methodology, which I thought was really exciting. And she says, in the first part I will invite audience participants to practice, so it starts from practice. Exercise for Kuchyangam eye training, Indian performance eye training. This training forms the basis for the actor's daily practice in the unique regional theatre. So she talks about practice straight away, she honors the practice. Super. This work is particularly relevant to the contemporary actor's affective process. She can articulate what her concerns are, because, and so on and so on and so on. So she articulates her concern, and then it says, the second part, after we've done the practice, I will conduct a microphenomenological interview on the experience with the volunteer and so on. So she's practicing also her interview methodology. But I was delighted to see that she's beginning to strengthen her practice where she places that.